Welcome to the 26th episode of Arbiter of Worlds. If you're a returning subscriber, thanks for supporting the channel. If you're new to the channel, hello! Here at Arbiter of Worlds, we study the art and science of running and creating tabletop role-playing games. When I launched this channel, I said going into it that the first 50 episodes would suck, because everyone sucks when they start doing YouTube. Now that we've crested the halfway mark, I figured it was time to start to suck less, so therefore I invested in this marvelous Shure M7 podcast microphone. Hopefully this gives a better sound quality to the videos. Today we're going to return to the topic of timekeeping in RPGs, following up on our thoughts from episode 25. In the interest of time and efficiency, I'm not going to rehash the prior episode, so if you haven't yet watched episode 25, go do that first, and then come back. The question we face is, what solutions are available to the problem of temporal paradoxes that can arise when a GM runs a multiplayer Bronstein-style campaign using Gygaxian one-to-one time? That is, one actual day equals one real day when players aren't actively playing. Let's go through the solutions, starting with the solutions that my fellow game masters have recommended, and then going into more esoteric methods. Solution number 1. Don't use one-to-one time with multiple parties. The most common solution to temporal paradoxes that GMs have adopted is to make sure there's only ever one timeline, and they do that by using variable time with single parties. This is the solution adopted by probably 98% of all game masters running RPG campaigns today. If you're not running a Bronstein-style game with one-to-one time and multiple parties, you've solved the problem. Of course, that also forecloses a broad and exciting frontier of new gameplay from your possibility set. It's not a very satisfactory solution. Solution number 2, deny the problem exists. The second most common solution to temporal paradoxes that I've heard from GMs using one-to-one time is to simply deny that they are a real problem that ever actually arises in play. Now, I personally suspect that these GMs are actually implicitly using one of the solutions I'll get to later, but I'm equally happy to take them at their word. You, as a GM, have preemptively solved 100% of the problems that never come up in your campaign. As Sun Tzu said, the greatest GM is the GM who GMs without GMing. Solution number 3, using a gentleman's agreement. In my episode, How to Handle Problems with Players in Your RPG, I described 3 styles of play: cooperative, cooperative competitive, and competitive. Each of these 3 styles is characterized by a gentleman's agreement, a metagame code about what is or isn't allowed in the context of the campaign. In a cooperative RPG, for instance, it would be against the gentleman's agreement to have your character murder his sleeping friends while he's on watch. In a competitive RPG, that would be perfectly acceptable. Shame on them for sleeping without a guard they can trust. If you're running a cooperative game where the players are allied and friendly to each other, then you can solve the temporal paradox problem by simply agreeing that causing a temporal paradox is outside the bounds of permissible play. Just as you can't murder Bob's character in his sleep for kicks, you can't mess up Bob's timeline for kicks. Now, this is actually a very good solution, but it doesn't work as well for competitive games. In a competitive game, each player is incentivized to win by any means necessary, and so if the GM makes a rule that a player's competitors cannot cause temporal paradoxes, even though they could do absent that ruling that is within the simulation, then the player is going to become incentivized to exploit that rule. For example, let's imagine that Bob and Jim both want their rival characters to get to the Tower of High Sorcery first. Both are starting 192 miles away. Bob's PC is on foot, moving 18 miles per day. Jim's PC is on a Pegasus that can fly 192 miles per day. Imagine that Bob plays regularly with the GM on Tuesday and Jim plays regularly with the GM on Wednesday. Those are just their regularly scheduled times to play. Well, Bob is obviously incentivized to use Tuesday to play 11 days of wilderness travel to get to the Tower of High Sorcery first, so that on Wednesday, when only one game day has passed in the one-to-one timeline, Jim cannot get there first. Now, if you're not running a competitive game, a gentleman's agreement might be the best method to handle temporal paradoxes. It has kept players from murdering each other's characters in their sleep for 40 years, and it will probably work to keep timeline paradoxes under control too. Solution number 4, you cap the number of days the timeline can advance. To understand this solution, we need to revisit the example I described last week, where in session 1, starting on the 11th day of the game month, Bob and Jim's PC undertook 14 days of travel in order to arrive at a holy sanctuary on the 25th game day. In session 2, which took place 1 week later in the real world and hence started on the 18th in the game world, Brian and Chris destroyed the holy sanctuary, creating a temporal paradox by doing so several days before Bob and Jim arrived at it safely. To avoid this problem, the GM could simply implement a rule that players cannot advance the timeline during play by further than the timeline will advance on the next scheduled session. For instance, if the GM is running weekly sessions, then no players can advance the timeline further than 7 days during any given session of play. Had our GM adopted this approach, then Bob and Jim would have been only halfway to the holy sanctuary at the end of the session on the 18th, and then on session 2, starting on the 18th, Brian and Chris could have then overtaken them and destroyed the sanctuary before they arrived. Voila, temporal paradox vanishes. Now this is a very elegant solution, and if you're running a multi-party Bronstein with fixed weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly sessions, this is a solution I'd recommend that you consider. It's clear, it's objective, and it keeps the game functioning at the same pace for everyone. However, what if you're running a campaign of great complexity, with activity taking place daily via Discord and virtual tabletops, perhaps even multiple GMs spread over multiple time zones? Well, that leads us to solution number 5, always on play. Always on play is the solution recommended by one-to-one time guru Jeffro Johnson. To understand Jeffro's approach, recall that in the AD&D DMG, Gary Gygax said, "It's best to use 1 actual day equals 1 game day when no play is happening." Jeffro's approach simply extends Gygax's rule for campaigns where play is constantly happening. Therefore, it is best to use 1 actual day equals 1 game day all the time because play is happening all the time. This is effectively solution number 4 solved using calculus. As the real-world time between sessions of play approaches 0, the game time approaches pure 1-to-1. There's never a temporal paradox because everyone is always on the same point in the timeline. The difference between a traditional single-party variable time campaign and an always-on 1-to-1 time campaign is similar to that between a single-player computer RPG and a massively multiplayer online RPG. In a single-player CRPG, you can save and exit the game at any time, and you can pick up where you left off. In an MMORPG, you can log out at any time, but the game world continues at a fixed rate without you, and you might return to find conditions for your character or the world have changed radically. Now, Gary Gygax could never have run AD&D using always-on play because the social media infrastructure necessary to do so simply didn't exist. But now it does, and so does the always-on approach, and so GMs can run massive, sprawling RPG campaigns with dozens of players acting in the world simultaneously as a form of tabletop MMO. Solution number 6, formalize the timeline consistency conjecture into game mechanics. Last episode, we presented Gygax's own solution to the temporal paradox problem. Gygax said, despite time preferences, the activities that have previously occurred should be allowed to stand as destiny has decreed those events. So Gary is essentially calling for this RPG version of the Novikov self-consistency principle to apply to the game world. Now, I did not endorse the solution that Gary espoused because it forces the GM to railroad players in ways that are subjective, which is detrimental to player agency. However, this solution could be redeemed if one made the timeline self-consistency conjecture into a metaphysical law of the game world that was instantly instantiated by game rules. Imagine, for instance, that before the start of the campaign, the GM tells his players, Kronos, god of time, works hand in hand with Atropos, goddess of fate, to ensure that everything happens as it ought. Should someone foolish take action that would violate what destiny has decreed to have necessarily occurred, they are instantly flung into the depths of the underworld, where they will likely perish. Okay, now let's apply this rule to our example with Bob, Jim, Brian, and Chris. Brian and Chris have just arrived at the Holy Sanctuary several days before Bob and Jim. If they were to just linger at the Holy Sanctuary, there's no paradox. If they were to now fly off to a new location, there's no paradox. But Brian and Chris decide to blow up the Holy Sanctuary, and as they begin to do so, shazam, the gods teleport them to the underworld. Now, the beauty of this approach is that it actually creates opportunities for emergent play and player agency. For instance, Bob and Jim might attempt to purposefully cause another temporal paradox somehow in order to get teleported to the underworld to rescue Brian and Chris. Or perhaps Bob and Jim knew Brian and Chris intended to blow up the Holy Sanctuary and purposefully created the temporal paradox in order to send them to Hades. This solution makes timeline manipulation part of the gameplay. Obviously, you would need to tune the blowback to temporal paradoxes to match the tone of the campaign. Perhaps it's a random roll with results that could affect either group. Perhaps it's a growing series of penalties that apply as you continue to pursue a path that leads to paradox. It certainly won't be the right solution for every campaign, but it might be for some. Solution number 7, avoid temporal paradoxes with parallel universes. The last solution we're going to address is using parallel universes to avoid temporal paradoxes. This approach is actually widely used in MMORPGs like Lord of the Rings Online, which want the players to be able to enjoy a single-player style quest line through a story, while also being able to enjoy multiplayer play in the game world. And the idea is simply that each player character experiences their own parallel universe. Thus, in Bob and Jim's world, the Holy Sanctuary is safe and secure. In Brian and Chris's world, it's been destroyed. MMORPGs are able to make this work by having multiple instances of locations. Location A in the game world actually consists of instances A1, A2, A3, and so on, representing different points in the timeline. Location B is likewise divided into instances B1, B2, B3. In an MMO, it's possible that a pair of characters might be able to quest together in location A, because they're both in instance A1, but then not be able to quest together in location B, because one is in B1 and the other is in B3, because he's further ahead in that location's quest line. Some MMOs, like the original Guild Wars, modify this approach. They have a central hub, which has only a single instance, but they have adventuring locations accessible from the hub that are all individually instanced. So in town, player characters exist in a shared world with fixed time, but out in the dangerous areas of gameplay, player characters each pursue their own timeline. I believe it would be possible to make this solution work in a tabletop RPG format, but it would require that the campaign world be designed from the ground up to support it. For instance, you could imagine a game that consists of a city within a magical dungeon below the city. Inside the city, game time advances 1-to-1 with actual time. In the magical dungeon, it advances at whatever rate the players play. And each time the dungeon is visited, it's a different instance from any other versions of the dungeon that other players might be in. And maybe the dungeon is made of pure chaos. Whatever the case, the normal rules of reality don't apply. Now, this video is getting long, so I'm not going to develop this idea any further, but I think it's fruitful territory for designers and game masters to expand in the future. I think we've spent enough time on this topic, so we'll close out now. Thanks for watching. Please take a minute to press the like and subscribe buttons and add a comment. I will see you next week in this instance of reality, unless there's a really weird Mandela effect between then and now.